Chapter 41 The Tundra. From the shore, the land sloped up to a high plateau. The grassy slopes were crowded with seabirds, who stared and screeched and nervously fluttered their wings as the robot hiked by. When she reached the top, Rod saw flat land sprawling out before her. Weeds and stones and tough little bushes blanketed the landscape, but there wasn't a tree in sight. Our robot had arrived at the tundra, where cold temperatures and short growing seasons made it impossible for trees to take root. Winding through the tundra was a stream. Kerplunk, the puffin, said it would lead to a glacier near the Northern Ocean, so Ross began marching using the stream as her guide. The tundra had once been covered in a permanent layer of hard frozen soil, called permafrost. These days, the soil would thaw by midsummer, and Ross left behind a trail of deep footprints in the spongy, soggy ground. She increased her speed from a march to a trot to a run. Rodents scattered as the robot thundered past. A fox watched as the mechanical creature galloped through his territory. Ross crested a small ridge and surprised a herd of musk oxen. They were burly beasts with long fur and short tempers. Breath puffed from their mouths as they charged at the oncoming robot. Without breaking stride, Ross launched herself into the air and soared over the herd, shouting, "I apologize for startling you." Then she landed and kept on running. She crossed wind-swept fields and leaped over thickets of shrubs and past hot springs that sent steam floating into the sky. But even in that remote wilderness, there were signs of human activity. A dirt road cutting through the tangled brush, stone walls coated with moss, rows of solar panels forgotten and falling apart. Ross noticed movement in the distance. She stopped and adjusted her vision and saw a man walking along a path. He turned and faced Ross. At that long range, the robot must have looked like a fellow human. But if the man were to come closer, he would see who she really was. After a moment, he raised his arms and gave a friendly wave. Ross waved back. Then the man continued walking, and the robot continued running, but with more caution than before. Throughout summer, there had been constant daylight in the far north, but the seasons were changing, and while Ross ran across the tundra, the sun set and the stars came out, and then the aurora appeared. Curtains of colorful light shimmered and billowed through the night sky. Back on the island, Ross had seen the aurora on occasion, but never this clearly. She stared, searching for information about the wondrous sight, but then she shut off that part of her computer brain, and she simply enjoyed the spectacular northern light show. The night was short, and soon the sun was rising. Morning light slowly spread across the tundra, and it glinted off something up ahead. A massive slab of ice and snow was nestled among the faraway hills. Chapter 42 The Glacier. Ross stood on a rocky outcrop and scanned the desolate landscape. There were cliffs and canyons and fields of boulders, and in the middle of it was the glacier. It was like a gigantic frozen river twisting through the rugged terrain. Far off at the other end of the glacier, a dark smudge stretched along the horizon. The Northern Ocean, Ross calculated that the fastest way there was to trek over the glacier, but the trek would be risky. The glacier was covered with slick ice and sweeping snowdrifts and deep crevices. A single slip, and she might never be seen again. The sides of the glacier had crumbled into piles of icy chunks. Carefully placing her hands and feet, Ross climbed up the chunks, higher and higher, to the very top, and then she set out over the glacier. The robot started slowly through that wintry world, but as she found her footing, the sounds of her crunching steps grew quick and steady. There were other sounds too. Wind whistled, pieces of ice clattered down cliff sides. Streams of meltwater rushed through furrows in the surface. The loudest sound came from the glacier itself. You see, that massive sheet of ice was gradually sliding into the ocean, and each time it shifted, it created powerful rumbling groans. As she hiked, the robot couldn't help staring at the bizarre frozen shapes around her. She was gazing at a great glittering block of ice when she stumbled and fell, and suddenly her smooth body was sliding downhill. Faster and faster she went, scraping and gliding and spinning out of control. She was hurtling towards something wide and flat and blue, and a moment later she splashed into water. A lake of meltwater had formed on top of the glacier, and there was Roz sitting in the shallows. The water was clear and calm, so the robot kicked off and swam for the other side. The lake became deeper and bluer the farther she went. She went almost halfway across when another powerful groan rumbled through the glacier. Then, mysteriously, Roz began sinking. Actually, the whole lake began sinking. The glacier had shifted just a little, but the movement had split the thick ice below. Now the lake was draining through the huge crack at the bottom. The robot sank lower and lower, and the crack came into view. Water roared and gushed through the opening, and the flow carried Roz over the edge. Down she fell, deep inside the glacier, and she splashed into a frosty pool. The flood waters immediately whisked her away. She slid along frozen chutes and slammed against the icy walls and sloshed through a network of hollows. Finally, the flow of flood water slowed, and then the robot skidded to a stop. She was in an icy cavern. The walls glowed with a blue light. Water was dripping everywhere. Hanging from the ceiling was a dazzling array of icicles. The longest icicles had descended to the floor and formed a forest of pillars. One wall of the cavern was crystal clear, and Roz noticed a lump in the ice. It was a mouse, frozen solid and perfectly preserved. It looked like the mice from back on the island, but this mouse must have been thousands of years old. Just then, the glacier rumbled, and Roz leaped away as enormous icicles crashed to the ground. If she wasn't careful, she might become trapped in the ice as well. The robot hollered, "Hello?" The cavern echoed, "Hello, hello? Can anyone hear me? Can anyone hear me? Hear me? How do I get out of this glacier? How do I get out of this glacier, this glacier?" Nobody was around to answer her questions. Roz would have to find her own way out. She hiked on, through tunnels and caves. At one point, she came upon an open shaft rising up through the ice, and high overhead was a small patch of sky. She chopped her hand into the wall like an axe, hack, and pulled herself up, hack, hack, hack. The robot climbed higher, and the shaft grew narrower, too narrow, so she climbed down and continued through the glacier on foot. Days passed. Roz wondered if she'd ever get out of that frozen maze. Eventually, though, she detected the faint sound of ocean waves, and she caught a whiff of salty air. And then she turned a corner and stepped into bright daylight. Laid up before the robot was a glorious northern seascape. Icebergs of every shape and size floated across the bay and toward the open oceans. Seabirds soared by on outstretched wings. Waterfalls poured from wide holes in the ice. The front edge of Glacier was made up of frozen cliffs that towered above the waves, and high up on one of those cliffs was Roz, a lone dark shape against an immense wall of white. The glacier rumbled, and little avalanches of snow tumbled down the cliffside. Another rumble, and a large hunk of ice plunged into the water. It occurred to our robot that she was still in serious danger. She quickly tried to calculate the safest way down, but she wasn't quick enough. The glacier rumbled again, and then the entire cliffside started breaking loose. The cliff tipped forward, slowly at first, but gaining speed until it crashed into the surf with a tremendous explosion of sea spray. Birds scrambled through the air. Icebergs smashed together. Waves rolled across the water and pounded the stony beaches. In time, the waves settled down, and calm returned to the bay. The ice cliff was now a massive iceberg floating away from the glacier. Below the iceberg, a sparkle, and Roz swam up from the depth. She had a few new dents and scrapes, but she wasn't upset. In fact, The robot felt something like delight that she had made it to the Northern Ocean at last. Chapter 43. The Beach. A layer of fog hung over the ocean. Icebergs drifted silently through the mist. The calm water rippled, and Rose's head rose up. Our robot needed to find the ancient shark, but how would she track down the shark in the vast northern ocean? Rose began to hear a chorus of deep grunts. Hidden somewhere within the fog was a gathering of beasts. She followed the grunting noises, and a coastline emerged, but the noisy creatures were nowhere to be seen. The robot marched out of the water and over the rocks and up a hill. The noises grew louder, and the fog lifted, and when Rose reached the hilltop, she looked down the other side at a beach that was packed with giant creatures. Brown bodies, pink faces, white tusks, walruses, tons of them. So many walruses had hauled themselves out of the water that the beach couldn't feed them all. They crowded onto the surrounding hillsides and onto slabs of ice floating offshore. The air was thick with pungent smells and with steam rising up from the herd. Surely one of the walruses would know where to find the ancient shark. Ross marched downhill toward them, but when she started climbing over a boulder, she knew she'd make a mistake. The boulder was soft and warm. Somehow it rolled onto its side, and two long tusks swung into view. "Get off me!" shouted a walrus. "I was napping!" Ross crashed to the ground, and the walrus raised his tusk, ready to strike. "I'm very sorry," Ross shouted. "I mistook you for a boulder." The walrus looked down at his body. "Now that you mention it," he said, "I do look a little like a boulder." He seemed to forget all about the robot as he admired his own boulder-like body. He flexed his muscles and puffed out his chest. Then he clambered atop an actual boulder for a comparison. The likeness was remarkable. Ross hated to interrupt the walrus, but she had a burning question. "Do you know where I can find the ancient shark?" Without taking his eyes off himself, the walrus replied, "Ask Big Shot, the beach master." Big Shot wasn't hard to spot. He was the biggest, toughest, loudest walrus in the herd. Ross headed in his direction, down the hill and onto the pebble beach, politely stepping through the crowd. "Excuse me, sorry to bother you. Pardon me." The lounging walruses groaned as she passed by, but they were too comfortable to move. Before Ross could call out to Big Shot, a white shape appeared at the other end of the beach. A polar bear was hunting for his next meal, but the bear didn't attack the walruses, not yet. He just lumbered along as panic swept through the herd. The walruses grunted nervously and erupted into the stampede, with Ross caught in the middle. Heavy bodies knocked her around. Long tusks clanked against her sides. Strong flippers shoved her down, and a walrus crawled over, crunching her into the pebbles. Ross struggled to her feet, then leaped up and away to safety. The herd was vanishing into the sea, so the polar bear moves faster, trotting back and forth, searching the crowd for an easy target. Finally, he found what he was looking for. A young walrus had been separated from her family. The polar bear sprinted across the beach and pounced on the youngest back. The walruses might have been young, but she was as big as the bear. She slashed her tusks and kicked her hind flippers and dragged the bear with her. If she could get to the water, she could escape into the depths, but the bear was strong and hungry and wouldn't let go. It looked like the polar bear would get his meal until Big Shot came charging to the rescue. Well, charging might not be the right word. The bull walrus moved as fast as he could, in a slow, wriggling sort of way. Then he lifted up to his full height and roared, "If you want her, you will have to kill me first." The polar bear was a fierce hunter, but he knew better than to fight the mighty beach master. He trotted off. The Big Shot escorted the young walrus into the waves. Minutes earlier, the beach had been overcrowded. Now only the robot and the polar bear were left. Chapter 44. The Polar Bear. Roz backed away as the polar bear stalked toward her. "Do not waste your energy hunting me," hollered Robert. "I'm not made of meat." The polar bear sniffed the air with his sensitive nose. He smelled the ocean. He smelled the lingering scent of walruses. He smelled his own musky odor, but he didn't smell anything he could eat. The bear slumped onto the beach and gazed at the sky. The sun was setting, and the stars were beginning to come out. "I'm hungry," growled the bear. "I'm always hungry. I can't remember the last time I tasted meat. I'm lucky to find eggs. Mostly I eat grass. That's no way for a bear to live. And then there's the poison tide. It hasn't spread here yet, but the fear of it has spread everywhere. The birds and the fish and the seals are leaving. The walruses will be next. Polar bears have always hunted here, but it might be time for me to move on." "The poison tide is destroying the island where I live," said the robot. "I have come here to speak with the ancient shark. I was told she will know what to do. Have you heard of her?" The polar bear snorted. "We've all heard of the ancient shark. Everybody says she's the oldest, wisest, most powerful creature in the north. But if she's so powerful, why hasn't she stopped the poison tide already?" "That is a good question," said Roz. "When I find her, I will ask her." The polar bear pointed high up to a bright star. "They say the ancient shark lives at the bottom of the ocean beneath that star. The other stars slowly move through the night sky, but that one stays still. It's called the guiding star because you can see it to find your way. Go toward the guiding star until it's right above you. Then you'll be in the home waters of the ancient shark." "Thank you for your help," said Roz. "I will do everything in my power to stop the poison tide. With luck, the birds and the fish and the seals will soon return." The polar bear licked his lips and dreamed of eating meat as the robot marched into the waves. Chapter 45. The Far North. The far north was a place of extremes. Entire seas froze over and then melted with the changing seasons. There were months of constant daylight followed by months of constant darkness. Many land animals lost their summer color and turned white to blend in with winter, though the winters weren't as white as they'd once been. Our robot was swimming through the Northern Ocean under a sky filled with stars. Fear of the poison tide had driven away countless ocean animals. There were fewer fish, fewer squid, fewer seabirds. Some of the larger animals remained, for now. Rose's head dipped underwater, and she heard a flurry of clicks and whistles, and when she popped up again, she spotted a family of whales glistening in the starlight as they raced through the waves. They were narwhals. Each of the male had a long tusk extending from his head. Roz wondered where the narwhals were going. Were they moving south to a place where they wouldn't have to live in fear? The farther Roz swam, the higher the guiding star climbed in the sky, until at last it was directly overhead. The robot stopped and treaded water. Roaming somewhere in the depth below was the ancient shark.